How's it going, everyone? And welcome today on this very special interview. I am joined by a rising star in the YouTuber world. You have seen his fine works in covering the hobby that we love so much in a unique way, from my perspective, anyway. How's it going, Baron Durup of Dungeon Masterpiece?
Hi, how's it going, man?
Well, I'm
Well,
fan
thanks for having me
friggin-tastic.
out
How about
here.
yourself?
I'm doing good.
Heck yeah. So one of the things that it stands out on your channel and all the stuff that you're putting out is the fact that you are a geopolitical expert. For the
I wouldn't
plebeians, such as myself, what the frick is geopolitics?
I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a expert, at least not yet. I am relatively well read on the subject compared to, uh I would say the person who knows nothing about it. I would put myself on the downslope of the Dunning-Kruger effect right now, where I don't know anything. But geopolitics is the study of how geography influences the way human society develops in the place where it is, and how those different cultures and societies interact with each other in relation to that geography. And that might sound really confusing, but for example, there are ramifications to a person's cultural upbringing if you live in the mountains as opposed to if you live in the inner city. And that might sound um, obvious when you first say it, but there are certain, human cultural manifestations that just come out no matter where you are in the world. There's very specific things that typically arise if you are living in the mountains. If you are living in the mountains, no matter where you are in the world, you probably are suspicious of people from the city. You probably have made everything yourself. You've probably got, and there are definitely exceptions, but you probably have not quite as good an access to education as. So, there are certain things, like if you grew up in a city at the mouth of a river near a well-protected ocean port, you're probably going to have a far more access to job opportunity than you would somebody living deep in, a cold plains up in North Dakota. And it doesn't matter if it's North Dakota or, upper Siberia. It's the same kind of terrain and the same kind of, financial and economic opportunities usually exist there. So it's just kind of the study of, uh, you know, what does where you are say about the opportunities that you have?
And that's not just on an individual level, right? You're not only looking at individual base, but also
Right.
communities and also countries and states and kingdoms
It's
and all of that.
right. Like an individual can be an anomaly, but when you take the mean of a society, then you can kind of generally heap people into cultural groups and define them by their geographic location and thereby define their ethnicity. Um, you know so like take for example Europe, which has an extremely varied amount of geography for its land masses. There's tons of little pockets of mountain chains and lots of little river valleys that cut through those mountain chains. And in every single change of geography all across Europe, there's another ethnicity. And while it's like the second smallest continent on the planet, it also has the most sovereign nation states on the planet for that very reason. Because, the Romanians and the Hungarians and the Austrians all have their own little pocket of, of ethnic valleys that they live in. So, it kind of, looking, once you start to peel back how geography influences all those things, then you can start to, analyze history and see why certain kinds of economic trends or military trends or, sociological trends have been so repetitive over time, and then make predictions about where our history is going today.
Absolutely. You know, when we think about kingdoms, you never have a kingdom that just has an invisible wall in the middle of a plain, right? An invisible border. You typically have, okay, I've got this side of the forest. Our barrier is that mountain peak right there. You know, things like that. That
Right.
definitely makes a lot of sense. And
Exactly.
you know, not only are you applying this to real life, but you're also a nerd. Or at least I've heard you're a nerd, right? So how are you
Yes.
applying this to your hobby, the games that you play, the tabletop role playing games that you enjoy?
It might shock some people to say that I don't actually do it so much, just because I tend to keep my game worlds very small, tight, and regional, and therefore very disposable. Just because I like world building, and I kind of develop like just one little region that has a central problem, and then the players get to level 10, they solve the problem, and I throw the map in the trash. Uh, you know, but I know but like priorly, in a prior DM life, I had a real passion for world building, and being informed now with this tool set of geopolitics, you can start to just look at the land masses on the planet, or take for example Faerun. You can start to look at a map of Faerun and think through, there's a river there. And that river has access to lots of plains area, but it's not surrounded by mountains. So the people who live there are probably going to be, wealthy merchants, but they also know that they're going to have to constantly be on ever vigilant watch and have a strong military, because they could get invaded from any direction at any time and it would disrupt their trade. So and you kind of see that in as an allegory for an example like that happening. You can look no further than the Kievan Rus, where Vikings in about 850 AD took various river systems down from the Baltic all the way to the Black Sea, and that group of nomadic early Vikings eventually settled the area that became Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, that whole stretch of landmass there. And that has been their modus operandi since 800 AD. And the people who they displaced before that, if you go look at, migration records, like genome migration records, it's evident that that also was a problem with an ebb and flow of human population across that plains. And there's strong evidence that these different peoples they either had to be very militaristic and defend themselves, and if they didn't, they got wiped out. So, you look no further than, the Scythians or the what's another one? There's another early group, the Magyars, came from that region and then settled in Hungary. So, it's interesting to, when you have that toolkit, you can analyze your own real world, and then just think through the geographical landforms in your fantasy world. You can start to put together these different tool pieces, and it's like, what exactly does Baldur's Gate have that makes it insecure? And then just start developing quest hooks out of that for your party to start exploring. It's less useful if your players are not into political intrigue, which I regret to say some of my players are not.
Oh.
They would just rather have a beer and play Hero Quest, basically. They want Hero Quest on steroids and an excuse to kill goblins. But they're as close as you can get to being murder hobos without actually being murder hobos. But
Murder hobos with the cause.
yeah, exactly. But I think from a world building perspective, that's really the toolkit, is that it enables you to develop to have an immediate understanding on why a nation state or why a ethnicity in a particular geographical place would feel secure or insecure, and what they would have to do in order to ensure their security. And from that, you get quest hooks. So, does that answer your question without
Absolutely.
rambling
Yeah.
too much?
No, no. That's why we're here, to hear you
Yeah.
ramble, and the dog,
Yeah.
of course.
Oh yeah.
So one thing I want to ask you is, I've seen that, of course, you've looked at Faerun, and you're going to be delving into more
hmm
things. Have you actually looked into, did TSR, the old guard in regards of Gary and all those people, did they actually hire, or did they have people that were geopolitical experts, or did they just simply like jot some stuff down and think that it looked cool?
I think it started as they just jot some stuff down and, it looked cool. But we all have to remember that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the two brains that created Dungeons and Dragons, um, they were, they were prolific war game writers before
Mm-hmm.
Gary Gygax founded TSR, and, Dave Arneson was hired into that, obviously. But their experience with wargaming, at least from a military point of view, the lessons you learn innately from wargaming are the same lessons that geopolitics teaches, at least about military purposes, right? Like, if you are doing a very large scale war game in a fantasy world, for example, and pretend to be, late 60s Gygax who just finished writing Chainmail. Or did Chainmail come out in 71, something like that? Think,
Somewhere in there.
Chainmail just came out, or you're conceiving Chainmail and you want to do an entire campaign. He had game worlds that he would do military campaigns in, with his chainmail rule set, or earlier rule sets for wargaming, and you can only learn over a course of history, over the course of your wargaming hobby career, that if you want your nation to be secure in a wargaming campaign, you have to control the mountain passes. And you have to control the rivers so that you can get the planes. There are certain things that you have to have from a military point of view, and unironically, those same things are the things that cause a nation to be prosperous, as far as through the lens of geopolitics as well. So, I think it was accidental, but you know, like I also did a geopolitical review of Greyhawk, and I have a light understanding of the lore of Greyhawk. I'm not going to call myself an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but like I pointed out, the Strait of Malacca would have like this ebb and flow, or excuse me, not the Strait of Malacca. What is it? There's the Strait of Sheldamar, in the southern end of the map. I called out that similar to the Strait of Malacca, there would be like this ebb and flow of piracy there, as trade patterns would wax and wane in the region, and you get to a point where, where was I going with this? Where, like I called out that there were likely pirates in the area, knowing full well that there's a powerful, brotherhood of pirates that's like 100,000 pirates strong or something there. But that's the current point in time in the lore, and that's not 200 years forward in the lore. 200 years forward, that piracy may just be, or that pirate kingdom might just be a backwater hole in the wall. So
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how these things develop over time, and
right.
the people that have been following D&D since its inception, going on 50 years now. There's obviously a lot that's changed in regards of not just the system itself, but just the way we perceive the games. Because unfortunately, I think a lot of people have done away with the kingdoms and warfare style of looking at the world. A lot of people have done away with building up, your keep and all that fun jazz. More often than not, we typically just see the world as a sandbox that starts off small, but once we get big enough, we can just teleport around it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how D&D has changed through the years to become like this it's so weird because the power creep of spellcasting in D&D has changed the game to be more wargamey and more problem solvy, but in the same respect, there's been this cultural shift that is almost antithetical to what D&D is. Like, if you look at the actual rules of Dungeons and Dragons, like how many actual pages are devoted to, social mechanics? How many rules are there for that? Very minimal. We're talking maybe 2.5 pages in the general rules, and maybe if you're lucky, there might be 24 spells out of some 300 that have to do with social interactions.
And
So
half of them are bad.
and half of them are bad. Like charm has been so nerfed that you can't even cast it in a meaningful way unless you're doing it on a character the player assumes to be a throwaway NPC, right?
Back in my day, charm person lasted 30 days, and there was no concentration.
Exactly. Like, concentration as a concept is brand new to I believe it's brand new to fifth edition. I'm sure somebody will at me in the comments if it was in fourth, and I don't remember.
You're actually wrong.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird juxtaposition that we as a culture of, D&D nerds have, and I don't mean like you and I mean like as in,
the royal
the royal, well, that's talking about me. But the, some 20,000 or 20 million RPG players on the planet, 25 million RPG players, there has been this cultural shift to focus on narrative storytelling away from that kind of sandbox adventuring that is very technical and, kingdom building, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, I think what honestly is a very important aspect of how our players perceive the world is our character sheet and our class. Because, quite frankly, that is how players see the game. And if you go look at, the original character sheets, it would be right there. At 9th level, a fighter has the title of a lord and can build a keep. At so-and-so level, this character can build a keep and get this many retainers. And as a barbarian, you get a whole bunch of... You can call, 2D 100 barbarians that, can come out of nowhere and assist you, right? That's a...
Exactly.
Nowadays, when you look at your character sheet says, "Oh, hey, I can hit people harder,"
Right. And I wonder why that is. That's something I've thought about, and I can't peg down why there was a shift there. I mean, who was the writer? Was it Monty Cook for 3rd edition that effectively got rid of all that stuff? Who was the game writer that wrote 3rd edition?
I want to say it was, yeah.
Okay. I believe it was Monty Cook. Somebody will correct us, I'm sure.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. But, when you went from AD&D 2nd edition to D&D and that stuff was absconded from the game, that's when I really feel like people started to care about, because 3rd edition also had kind of this crunchy, early version of MMO style, leveling up, getting skill points and spending them. And, it reflected something that was very character-centric. Whereas prior versions of D&D, the character sheet forced you to be very... Maybe this is a good way to think about it. In earlier editions of D&D, because your character sheet was so lightweight, it forced people to look out on the world. Your character sheet forced you to be very external of the game world. Whereas the moment the game started getting crunchy, it forced you to start being very internal. So instead of, back in the 80s, the concept of a character background was a completely ludicrous idea. I'm a 3rd level elf. And my character background is that I had 2 levels of elf before that, So, now it's people will create this diatribe and, pray to sweet macabre that the DM sticks something from their character backstory into the game, even though their character backstory is utterly meaningless by the time they hit 7th level, because all of the abilities and magic that they'd have would be able to solve any problems they had in their backstory with the snap of a finger, you know. So it's a really weird thing that culturally we want to tell stories about characters, but the game doesn't really support that.
It's been an interesting shift for sure, and equally as important to that cultural shift is not only what the game is telling us, but the way people are getting dragged into the game. And right now, one of the
Right?
biggest ways people are getting dragged into the game is by the notable celebrities such as Matt Mercer and Joe Manganiello and Matt Colville and things like that.
Right.
So my question to you then is, how do you feel about the cultural impact of these celebrities bringing in people and effectively, air quote, teaching people what the game is?
It's always a double-edged sword, something like that. There's always going to be trade-offs, and this is a really interesting question because on the one hand, you have celebrities, um, who are bringing a lot of people into the fold, you know, and they have certain influences. But that being said, okay, so let me back up here. I think people who were brought in to Dungeons and Dragons because of a particular celebrity, be it Matt Mercer or Brendan Lee Mulligan or Joe Manganiello, they're I think that they believe that those celebrity influences are larger than they actually are. Um, and I say that by looking at, I've kind of been following around and looking at metrics from, especially over the pandemic. Um, Wizards of the Coast added some 9 million players over the course of the first year of the pandemic. But Critical Role only gets 2 million views a video at best.
A
They
trifling
only
sum,
have
really.
what well, it's not a trifling sum. It's not a trifling sum. But, Critical Role has also been around since 2015. And they've not added that, like, they've definitely grown their audience, but they've not added D&D, or they've not added watchers to their streams at the same rate that Wizards of the Coast has added new players. So, and the same goes for Acquisitions Incorporated or, Dimension 20 or any of those other live streaming, Let's Plays. But, or live plays, I should say. But, I actually think it has more to do with it being in pop culture references. So we had, what's it called?
Stranger Things.
Oh, no, not. I'm getting to Stranger Things, but that's not what I'm thinking of. All the nerds in the apartment in New York. Oh gosh, what is it?
Nerds Apartment, New York.
Big Bang Theory.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know if you heard that. My fiance just shouted that out. Thank you. But you had Big Bang Theory, and they started to normalize Dungeons and Dragons. Obviously you had Stranger Things, where like the comedic relief of the plot was based on Dungeons and Dragons, and you end up in a situation where if Critical Role is not adding all of those players to the D&D community, then they have to be coming from what? Like, that's the question, right? And when you have shows like that, especially Stranger Things, influencing young children who grow up watching it, you have Gen Z children growing up watching that with their Gen X parents. Neither of those generations have any real affiliation to Matt Mercer and Friends or Critical Role. They got exposed to it through that, especially the Gen X people, because they remember when, Dungeons and Dragons back in the 80s had its Satanic Panic and What Monsters and Mazes came out.
oh, yeah.
So like and Gen X is always very much a stick it to the man. Uh, they're like that's kind of their zeitgeist is the boomers got everything and left none for the Gen X's, so I'm just gonna take everything I can get and stick it to the man. So this is kind of their thumbing back at the man and teaching their Gen Z kids to play D&D. So the D&D community has grown considerably, I think, because of the normalization of it in pop culture, and celebrities who play D&D definitely have their influence. I'm not discrediting their add to that, but it's I think it's important to understand that that's currently where I believe that's where the majority of these new players that have entered the hobby in the last 2 to 3 years, that's where the bulk of them have gone from. Then here's what I think is the troubling part is that the most active communities in the D&D zeitgeist are the ones who are the ones who are online the most are not in those camps, right? They're not the Gen Xers who have the kids that they're teaching D&D. So they have this, fan fascination underpinned to them. And, like any fan base, they can have a very particular way that they expect the game to be played. Like we all have heard about the Matt Mercer effect. And I think it's less Matt Mercer and more Critical Role. I don't actually blame Critical, and I don't blame Critical Role for any of this whatsoever. But when there is a very active internet fan base of a particular celebrity, 2 million views and counting is nothing to sneeze at. When that is 30% of the new D&D players that WotC added to the hobby over the last 2 years, that's a staggering number. So whenever these Gen Z student, whenever the 12-year-olds start going on to internet forums or Reddit or whatever and start poking around and looking for advice, they may bump into a very different kind of D&D from this culture than what their parents taught them, right? Or what they thought it looked like in Stranger Things, or the silliness that they might have saw in Big Bang Theory. So it's a really interesting thing because you end up with that. What am I trying to say here? You end up with this really strange cultural tension and fracturing, I feel like, in the RPG community because of that.
Absolutely. And coupling on top of that is the fact that a lot of times I hear a lot of people say D&D when in reality they are trying to say the analogous tabletop role-playing game, because D&D just so happens to take up the whole, oh yeah, you're playing D&D. Well, I'm actually playing this other game system, but sure, call it D&D
right.
real quick.
Yeah, it's like the Band-Aid. We don't call Band-Aids, we don't call adhesive bandages, adhesive bandages. We call them Band-Aids.
Exactly.
You don't call them you don't call them like facial tissue wipes. You call them Kleenexes.
Exactly.
The brand has become the thing. So and D&D is definitely that. But they obviously completely dominate the market. Like Kobold Press and Chaosium and what's the other one? Paizo. Like even their combined sales, and Chaosium is huge in Japan. Like there are so many Call of Cthulhu players in Japan. Even counting all that, they don't even come to 5% of the sales that Hasbro WotC is able to crank out over D&D. So like the concept of competition is just so laughable. If you play something that's not D&D, you're definitely the weirdo.
Man, I feel so bad playing Call of Cthulhu now. Gosh darn it. Yeah, yeah, it is one of those things where D&D success obviously means some great things, but it also means some potential not great things for the hobby, and I think that can be a bit of an issue because I don't always want to sit down to play D&D. Sometimes I do want to sit down to play
Yeah,
something else, and I know for a fact that
right.
you play other game systems as well, right? So what
Oh yeah,
systems are
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
are you loving right now?
Um, so I've really started to get, I got lulled into the OSR movement, which reorganized and polished the Gygaxian rules into this new thing. For those who are unfamiliar with the OSR, it stands for Old School Revolution or Old School Renaissance. And then there's even a sub community in that recognized that the OSR is really just like the old school versions of D&D, like first edition, Moldvay edition, basic and expert edition D&D from back in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, they recognized that these projects that tried to revive all of that stuff, it was never going to go back. We always have to go forward. You can't just wear rose-colored glasses and say those were the good old days, right? Like that doesn't actually work anymore. Because we as players are we're just for better or for worse, polluted, tainted. What's the non-derogatory word from that? We're affected. We are affected by the community of RPG players that we live in today. Like, and it is a very different community than what we lived in 1970. So, or 1980. So, the new school revolution recognizes this and says, okay, so if these are the things that make OSR good. If they identify very specific things like highly deadly combat, a lightweight approach to character building, an emphasis on collaborative world building and storytelling, as opposed more the GM as the referee and not the storyteller. Letting the world naturally evolve as the players guide the story, creating situations and not storylines. Um, if you start to take OSR and rip out all the stuff that doesn't support those very specific things, then you start to converge on a smaller movement within that movement called the NSR, or the New School Revolution. And that's where I find myself gravitating more and more today. So the two games that I harp on the most that are my favorites are Mouse Ritter and Cairn. Those are my two go-tos. You can learn to play the game in a 10-minute booklet read. The rule books are 32 pages long. Everything is super streamlined. You don't roll to attack because rolling to attack is boring. You just do the damage. If NSR in a nutshell of like how streamlined, simplified, and deadly NSR is. Just as a point of example, they recognized that the community recognizes that if you are rolling to hit and you hit, let's just say for the sake of the argument, 50% of the time, and 50% of the time, therefore you do 1d6 plus 3 damage, then why not just roll damage every round at half that amount? Because sometimes it can be wildly swingy and you'll land a bunch of damage. Sometimes it's so weak that the armor value, which in these style games usually just absorbs damage, completely absorbs all of it. So those are my two big NSR games. Then there's also, I love Mothership. I think Mothership is probably the current masterclass of RPG design. I think when people want to design their own RPG, Mothership is where they should look for lessons learned. It is very much a game of how can everything about the rule book, like the rule book is self-aware. The rule book recognizes that it itself is an artifact, and that artifact should be useful to the players and to the GM at the table. And it tries to do everything it can to simplify how you access the information in the book and keeps everything very concise and terse. It also has the same approach to the way it designs the character sheet. The character sheet is a literal flow chart that you use to fill out your character, right? You don't even need the book to fill out your character sheet. You just follow the steps, and in 10 minutes you have your character. And lastly, it has basic resolution mechanics for stuff, right? Like you have to roll checks of some kind to see if you can succeed or fail. And for the record, it is a sci-fi horror game. Think Alien or The Thing or Invasion of the Body Snatchers or stuff like that. But it has a basic resolution mechanic, but then it also has a very simple system for tracking how scared or panicked your character is. And by having that one additional clear, concise roleplay prompt baked into the rules is the horror, right? And this is I don't know exactly who said the quote, but if it's on the character sheet, it's in the game kind of thing. Like if you think about 5th edition, rogues get sneak attack and they get second story work and all these things, and it's on the character sheet. And when characters try to figure out what they're gonna do to solve the problem, they look at their character sheet, they pick like a freaking menu in a JRPG. They go through the list, they find the thing that they want to do, and then they do it, right? So whatever's on the character sheet has direct ramifications to what narratively happens in the game. And by having a mechanic for that prompting of fear, the horror of Mothership is therefore baked into the game. And it no longer becomes a problem that the players or the dungeon master has to try to solve in order to reinforce that horror tone. And that's why I think Mothership is like the gold standard. This is the platinum standard, in fact, of how to design an RPG system. And in fact, if I were to design an RPG, I wouldn't release it unless it was as good as Mothership.
High order.
Yeah. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Those 3 RPGs: Mouse Ritter, Cairn. Cairn is basically like the NSR equivalent of D&D. Mouse Ritter is the NSR mouse guard, if you will. Your mouse. You are a mouse-sized mouse in a fantasy mouse world that stacks on top of a normal, mundane human world with like modern human world where like cars are driving around and people live in houses, but then the owls can have magic spells and know and see everything, and your little mice who can go on adventures using sewing needles as swords, stuff like that. So both of those are super fun.
Yep. And you get a little mouse company, and your mouse company goes up against one large snake, Like, I love that stuff.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah. Cats are worse than dragons because you can't kill them unless you hire a warband.
Yep.
And to hire a warband of mice, you have to find a community of like 100 plus mice and convince them that attacking the cat is the right thing to do.
Yeah. And then on to Mothership, you mentioned the whole horror aspect. And one thing I love about Mothership is the fact that, of all the classes, you have the teamster, you've got the nerdy scientist, you've got the soldier, but then you've got the android. And the android, being a robot, you're not scared of anything, you're a robot. But the fact that you are so creepy because you're an android, you make everyone else around you more terrified. Like, that's fantastic. I freaking love it.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the best mechanics in the game. What else is really good, because, the saving throw system is a little wonky compared to 5th edition. You're constantly making saves against everything in Mothership because it's a horror RPG. But, the android has the lowest sanity save. So whenever an android sees something that does not compute, like it blows their circuits, right? And if the android goes nuts, everybody goes nuts. So yeah, it's a real fun vicious cycle of panic-inducing mechanics.
Yeah. And speaking of games such as those, like you might have never even heard of this, dear viewer, dear listener. But the thing to consider is on Kickstarter, these games are killing it. I don't know if you just saw, but
Massive.
Old School Essentials just hit like 800K. There was a Murkberg little like pirate thing that hit several hundred thousand. There was a Mothership Kickstarter that just hit several hundred thousand. These games are, thankfully because of Kickstarter and GoFundMe's and things like that, people are able to put out game systems that obviously can't compete with 5e because 5e is, the thing.
Yeah.
But even still, you're able to succeed, and that is great. That means that we're going to get a
Right.
lot of variety. That means you're going to be able to find the game system that really does appeal to you, and that's fantastic.
Yeah. It's really interesting because like 5e, by having this monopoly, by Hasbro having a monopoly on, and they absolute, like, there is no competition. In fact, Hasbro owning D&D means that they have such a dominant monopoly on the RPG community that to purchase Dungeons and Dragons, any other gaming company wouldn't be able to afford its valuation. Paizo can't afford it. Games Workshop can't afford it. Avalon Hill can't afford it. There is no other gaming company that could afford to purchase Dungeons and Dragons as a brand from Hasbro for its valuation. Like, can't be done. So, as a result, you get to have a community of all these underground games that is far more robust because nobody is caught up in a bitter stalemate between 2 to 3 RPG systems, if that makes sense. And that wasn't the case back in the 80s. Like D&D was definitely the clear dominator of the field, right? But there was Palladium, there was GURPS, and these games definitely had a much larger market share compared to Dungeons and Dragons than Fate Core does against D&D today. GURPS might have been there for a while, 10-15% of the gaming market back in the early 90s. There's no like even all of the RPGs combined today that are not Dungeons and Dragons, if you lump them all into one bucket, they still don't probably come up to 10% of what Wizards of the Coast is able to produce. But that means that you get to have a lot of creative leeway than be caught up in the drama of the late stage monopoly or the dualopoly, I should say.
Yes, not only does Hasbro have a monopoly, but they are Monopoly. they own Monopoly,
Right.
right? What are the
Right.
chances?
That's
So,
hilarious. I didn't put that together. That's really funny.
I mean, what are the chances, right? You know, going back to you. You have been putting out some videos, and you've been pretty much killing it. You've been
Thank you.
you've been dominating it not only in the content but the quality therein. And something
Thank
I
you
wanted to
very
ask
much.
you is, what are you trying to add to the sphere of the hobby or YouTube or anything? What are you trying to add here, or if you're trying to add anything at all?
No, so as it should be apparent, like I have this not an affiliation. I have an affinity for the OSR, right? And the way the D&D was played back in the old days, back when I was in middle school, and that was how we all did it. And I recognize that a lot of dungeon masters that are entering the scene now uh, have absolutely no experience with that style of play and how it can be used for effective storytelling. And uh, there is a lot of D&D advice on the platform that discusses the basics of the game or the mechanics. But there are very few people that, dissect the rules or dissect how the rules are constructed in a way that the mindset of the OSR community does it without being antagonistic of 5e, if that makes sense. And I played 5e straight for 5 years. Like 5e, there's a lot of people who are. I'm to be clear, I am currently sick of playing fifth edition. But that doesn't mean, but that doesn't mean that I don't respect that is what a lot of people intend to play and continue playing. But I also want to expose these 5e players to a different way of thinking about the game that they might not have considered before, thanks to the cultural impact of various D&D celebrities like Matt Mercer or Anthony Mulligan. So, when you can start dissecting the game and illustrate what those things are, I really feel like that's my value add is how can you apply these different methods of understanding the rules, dissecting the rules, and better understanding like why you should homebrew a thing, better understanding why a certain rule behaves a certain way, what that actually means. So a lot of people perceive that have only played 5th edition D&D, they perceive the rules as air. And I want people to step back and look at the system as an actual construct rather than, and I say that very pointedly because I see a lot of people just trying to like hack and homebrew 5e, and they think like, I want to make my, they don't think about what is a problem that needs to be solved to make my dungeon mastering or my storytelling more effective. They say, I want my game to have this thing in it, so they make a homebrew thing to have it. And while that's a fun practice, while that can be a fun exercise, I'm not sure that it is the right framework in which to approach homebrewing or approach game design. And I hope that when people watch my channel, they come away with a better appreciation for the construction of any RPG's rule set and analyzing what is it that makes a particular rule behave the way it does, and why can that be a negative impact on my story. So, it's something that I complain about 5th edition. And honestly, this is really my only complaint, is that all of the mechanics are so tightly wound that homebrewing is actually quite difficult to do well. A lot of people will say that it's, very, very easy to hack apart and do whatever you want with. But, removing any particular rule set has cascading effects to other parts of the game. So you kind of have to keep everything present in order for the rules to still be completely cohesive. You can't just sweepingly get rid of death saves because you want a more deadly game. But what could you do to keep death saves yet make it a more deadly game? If I were trying to run a Bloodborne style game, for example, or a Dark Souls game, I wouldn't need some publishing company to come out with a massive, huge 600-page compendium or whatever it is that is currently being worked on. I would just change one rule, and that is you only get one death save, and when it's your next turn in initiative, that's it. You fail it. You don't get to roll. You just fail it. And by doing that, you rapidly increase the fragility of the characters, but you still keep the spirit, all of the cohesiveness of the rules intact. So, does that answer your question? Kind of a long-winded way.
Yeah,
it's, what are the actual rules telling me that my story will look like if I play with these rules? And what can I do in a minimally impacting way to solve problems that I see in them so that I can tell the story that I want to tell. That's what I think my value add to the channel is. And then there's also, geopolitics.
That little thing.
Which is it's just fun as a world. Yeah, that's just fun as a world building tool. So it's stronger, right?
Alrighty. So yeah, we've talked a lot about all these different things. So some things I want to ask you is, what do you want to see next? So first things first, what do you want to see next from the companies that are producing these games? What do you want to see next from the companies that are, putting out the content that we consume?
That's a good question. I have to really think about that. What do I want to see next from WotC? I want to see a version of Dungeons and Dragons that you can easily teach to an 8-year-old. Because we currently don't have that. And I think even most OSR forward games, like even old school Essentials, I still think might be too complicated for an 8-year-old to grasp. It's pretty close. You can get away with it, but like pick up any random 8-year-old on the street and
don't get arrested.
You could and don't get arrested. Pick up any 8-year-old kid off the playground and I want to get tools into children's hands so they can start exploring their imagination at a younger age in a form that they can sit down with adults and have an agreed upon contract that keeps the game from going completely off the rails the way children's imagination does. And I say that because the younger that you can get kids to express their zany ideas within safe bumper bounds, right? The more permission you give to kids to go wild and crazy with ideas in storytelling inside those bounds without, driving the parents crazy, if that makes sense. Like, I want kids at 6 years old to start playing D&D. And I would love, like, the fact that Wizards of the Coast is putting out, like, children's picture books of various monsters. And, like, you're even seeing comic books now for young children that, explain the concepts of hit points. Even though they've never played a tabletop RPG, like, they explain these things. Like, kids can use something very simple in order to make that happen. Tiny D6 kind of scratches that itch, but there's so much complexity in like the skill list that unless a kid is actually going to sit down and read a very dense list of skills, then that becomes problematic as well for a child that young. You can do that with a 9 or a 10-year-old, but there's a huge maturity gap between a 10-year-old and a 7 or an 8-year-old. And I'd like to see children be able to play RPGs, especially something that is that well marketed that WotC can pull off that young. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense? Like, anybody can go out and make a children's RPG, sure, but nobody has the marketing spending power to really bring children into the hobby the way Hasbro does. So,
I mean, I've always been saying it, but 5e is not something I would ever teach to anybody new to the role-playing game sphere. All right, you have a 16, so a 16 means you have a +3, and that +3 adds to this thing. And by the way, you have an invisible +2 here, and by the way, if you're 5th level, that means you cast 3 3rd-level spells, but you can't cast that many spells. Like there's just numbers that just come out of nowhere, which if you're a nerd, you know them because you know them. But if you're not a nerd, you don't know them. And it's so hard to the fact that the worst part about getting into D&D is the actually getting into D&D, like that's bad. Like you need to make that barrier as small as possible.
There's no easy on-ramp for D&D.
Yeah.
And and WotC doesn't do itself any favors either. Like even from a dungeon mastering perspective, they try to teach new DMs how to run a game through the presented medium of the adventure module, right? So if you look at Lost Mines of Phandelver, for example, I love picking on Lost Mines of Phandelver because it's such a great story. Like the actual story of what happens in Lost Mines is so good for a new, like, you've got goblins, you've got an evil wizard, you've got some sneaky stuff going on in a cave, there's a dragon. Like every box is checked, but the delivery of the content is just so dense and railroady that it forbids players who have no preconceived notion of how to run a game read the Lost Mines of Phandelver from front to back, and they learn that that is how you were supposed to run a game, and it becomes this sloggy railroad, as opposed to something that could be much more freeform. And I hear a lot of, I've got a video talking about that. I hear a lot of comments from people saying, "Oh, this is just how people need to learn to play," and I'm like, those kinds of modules didn't exist, or you had to purchase them separately back in so long ago. Like look at Keep of the Borderlands. That those kinds of long diatribe block texts or the super railroadiness that just didn't exist, and people learned to play D&D just fine. We've got a whole community dating back to 74 where people learned how to do it that way. So I struggle with that. That's I don't know exactly what I was responding to there that triggered that thought.
Alrighty, so that's what you want to see next from the companies. But what do you want to see next from the community? What do you want to see from the people like me and you? What do you want to see from the people that are not the mega millionaires putting out these blockbusters? What do you want to see from them?
Just keep doing what you're doing. There's a lot of content creators who are motivated to do the things that they're motivated to do, and when you have that kind of entrepreneurialism, when you have that kind of free creativity to do whatever you want, then you will create the thing that you were inspired to create, and just if you make something, put it up on the internet. Let other people attack it. Let other people have at it. Let other people use it. Share what you've got, because somebody might come along and come up with an idea that is so pervasively good that WotC adopts it in 6th edition D&D. That could be you. So you could be that guy. I'd like to remind everybody that the concept of Eberron came about because somebody took their game world, polished it up, and sent it into Wizards of the Coast. And, now we have this steampunk fantasy world, which, by the way, I'm going to be doing a geopolitical analysis of the game world of Eberron very soon on my channel. Just share what you make. Share what you make.
Absolutely. I think that more so than we learn from, the companies, I think we learn a lot from each other, because just the fact of the matter is there's more of us. And there's so much things to take from, so many ideas to steal, so many things to borrow, so many people to interact with in the community, that we need each other, because we are the thing that make the companies great. It's not the companies making us great, right?
Right. Exactly.
And,
yeah. I mean... Yeah. If we weren't there making all this homebrew content for it, it wouldn't exist. And that was part of the big roadblock for 4th edition, is that they never released an open game license for 4th. So, third-party content was very, very slim. It had to be licensed through WotC. I don't know why that was. I think it's because, everything went completely hog wild with 3rd edition. And, there was some saucy and illicit things that were published, to be used with Dungeons and Dragons that had some negative things about it. And I think, I can understand and respect the decision WotC had excuse me, to not publish an open game license for fourth edition to try and distance themselves from that. But in the same right, like just because somebody makes an extremely uh, an underground bigotrous or sexist uh, module doesn't necessarily mean that represents D&D as a whole, or that WotC is endorsing it. It's just a third party license.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean, so.
And lastly here, what do you want to see next from yourself?
What do I want to see next from myself? I want to figure out how to make more time in the day so that I have about 30 to 32 hours every day. Like, I just need a magical 6 hours that doesn't exist so I can get more D&D content made. I've got a lot of plates spinning in the background, and I joke with some of my coworkers. I went to bed, caught the flu, and I had 2,000 subscribers, and I finally woke up from the flu 2 weeks later, and holy crap, I had 25,000 subscribers, and found myself with a part-time job. So running this as a side hustle and giving it its full respect, but also trying to be of service to the people who are discovering the channel and making sure that I'm able to continue providing exactly what my core message is to them, and not it'd be silly of me to not take any sponsorship opportunities or pursue anything like that. Like, obviously I'm going to do that, but I want to make sure that I have enough time to pursue the things that reinforce for my viewers the tools that that I've purported to have as something that I can give to them. Like, one thing that I want to do that I discussed on a another podcast, World Build with Us, you should check them out, is they asked me, what geopolitical fantasy world building book exists, like, what would you recommend? And I'm like, I don't think there is one. Like, that doesn't exist. And then the joke became, well, you should write it. Well, I've started writing an outline. Like, I've got an outline, I've got some loose notes, but the fact of the matter is, like, it's very hard for me to sit down and maintain my schedule of writing scripts, producing video content, getting that message out. Also, working with various business opportunities that present themselves when they do, and then also having time to write the book, and also having a full-time job. All of that is very mentally taxing. So, and not only that, but also taking time to spend quality time with my fiance and our 3 dogs. That's also something that I absolutely cannot lose sight of, because I probably wouldn't be running this channel if it weren't for her support. So,
Doll. Well, it sounds like the full-time job has to go then.
I know, right?
It sounds like that. It sounds like throw that thing right out the window.
Yeah, my boss jokes about that all the time. He's like, "You're blowing up, dude. How many months before you put in a 2-week notice?"
You're like, months. You're talking about days.
No, definitely not there. Holy cow!
I mean, but yeah, you say that, but you're gonna wake up tomorrow to 1 million subs, and you're gonna be like, "Okay, time to leave."
No. Honestly, I don't think my content is what is it? Approachable enough to be that big. Of course, then I look at probably the two YouTubers I aspire to the most, with an honorable mention to Questing Beast here, but Professor Dungeon Master and Matthew Colville. And I don't know if it's ironic or unironic that in my comment section, those are the 2 people that I usually get compared to. So I don't think I'll be quite as big as those guys, but we'll see. I don't know.
I mean, there's only one way to find out. It's by doing what you're doing.
Just keep on going. Yeah, I don't know. The moment I feel like I'm not adding actual valuable content to my viewers, that's when I'll quit. So.
Alrighty, you heard it here first. We're not gonna get any quitting until he becomes number one D&D YouTuber.
Oh my gosh.
Number one. Let's go. Alrighty, I think that's gonna wrap it up for us today. So go ahead and sell yourself.
Sell myself?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. If you've not seen my channel, come check it out. Dungeon Masterpiece. I'm Baron Durup, and kind of put me on the spot to sell myself there. But yeah, if you like history lessons, ideas pulled from video games on how to make your D&D better, and that sounds really weird, but I think I think video games are actually a good allegory in certain respects for how to do world building and story building. Or if you're just interested in fantasy geopolitics, come check out my channel.
All right. That is going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to all the people that are keeping the lights on around here. You all are the real MVPs, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.